Good evening and good morning, everyone. This is Joe Atwill. I'm here with Dr. Hans and Jan, and Hans and Jan are here to pump you up. Sorry, I just couldn't resist. Anyway, so okay, I will never do that again. So I'm really glad that you guys are here. This is a pleasure for me and for our audience because I got to listen to the show that you two did that has appeared on Gnostic Media that I thought was just so very insightful, which basically covered a trajectory of concepts from Trist, that would be Eric Trist, I believe. Or is Eric the son? Forget the name of it.
No,
but
Eric's the father.
Okay, so it's Eric Trist at the Tavistock with his theories of social control, which were very prescient, as Dr. Rutter reminded us and pointed out that in 1963, Trist in the Tavistock Institute was talking about a kind of permanent social turbulence that was about to begin. Very prescient, very interesting, because shortly thereafter, the hippie came about, which of course was quite a shock, and of course also the drug taking went along with it. And then beyond this, Jan and Hans discussed the changing images of man, and Han pointed out that there was quite a bit of overlap between Trist's work and the changing image of man. The changing image of man was a little softer, but in fact had the same kind of social control dimension. So at this time, between say 1960 and 1970, there was just this tremendous amount of sociologic theorizing and experimentation that was going on that was all in many ways related into MKUltra, the CIA project that we discussed so much. Many of the same individuals overlap into this, between these different organizations. You have the Macy Conference, having many of the individuals inside of it ending up in MKUltra. And I wanted to actually start out the show just by reading something which is not from the Macy Conference and not from the Frankfurt School, which was this institution that existed before the Macy Conference, which many people have shown that these individuals inside the Frankfurt School, which basically developed the concept of political correctness, that these individuals end up at the Macy. But I just wanted to reference something that occurred between the Frankfurt School and the Macy Conference, which then led into MKUltra. And I just think it's fascinating. And I don't know if I have ever showed this to you or discussed this with you, Hans, but there was a period of time when basically the majority of the Frankfurt School individuals were hired by an organization called the American Jewish Committee. And they were hired to do a survey of basically of American society with the eye to how it could be shaped so that there would be no threat to Jewish people. This wasn't the stated goal, but if you look at the actual science that this organization produced, you can see that there's a direct relationship to this concept, that they developed these scales, ways of testing individuals. One was called the fascism scale. It's very famous. Another is called the anti-Semitic scale. And then a third one was the ethnocentric scale. So these scales were used to try to determine basically people who were threatening in some ways to Jewish people. And then at the end of this science, they produced a conclusion. And I just want to read it to you. So that basically it just says that that fascism is something that goes against the basic interests of people. And they people cannot often see the workings of society or their own role within it due not only to social control that does not tell the truth, but to a blindness that is rooted in their own psychology. Okay, so there's a blindness. So resistance to self-insight and resistance to social facts are contrived. Now, that statement is referring to the neurosis that the AS, the anti-Semitic scale, develops. So anyway, so they conclude that resistance to self-insight and resistance to social facts are contrived, most essentially of the same stuff. It is here that psychology may play its most important role. Techniques for overcoming resistance, developed mainly in the field of individual psychotherapy, can be improved and adapted for use with groups and even for use on a mass scale. Wow. So I'll just read that again. Techniques for overcoming resistance developed mainly in the field of individual psychotherapy can be improved and adapted for use with groups and even for use on a mass scale. Now, the reason why I find this so fascinating is that when you look at MKUltra, and after listening to the show that Jan and Hans did, which is on the Gnostic Media website, and I hope everyone goes there and listens to it, it becomes clear that there were quite a few precursor elements that led up to sort of that went into this project, you know, that MKUltra developed to destroy the counterculture. But one of the ones that has not been really looked at is this statement at the end of the authoritarian personality. This is the conclusion that is given, and I want to read the names of the authors of it. Theodore Adorno, Elsie Frankel Brunswick, Daniel Levinson, and Nevitt Stanford. Adorno is well known. Frankel, she was, I believe, married to one of the guys who ran the Princeton Radio Project. Levinson is actually referenced in MKUltra papers. And Nevitt Stanford. Now, good old Nevitt went on to be a big shot at the SRI, which was used oftentimes within the MKUltra auspice. And he wrote a book was one of the authors of a book promoting LSD. Very interesting stuff when you listen to Hans and Jan's discussion of this presentation that the Esalen organization put on, which promoted the development of psychosis as a good idea, something that you really want to lapse into. So anyway, I just wanted to tell you guys that I have seen this connection, and in looking for the rationale for MKUltra, you know, it's hard to understand. You know, it's very hard. Well, why would anyone actually put forward something like Subproject 58, right, with the attempt to basically start to control the population? Well, when you look at the overlap between the individuals in the Frankfurt School, the American Jewish Committee, the Macy Conference, and then into MKUltra, you can see that the same individuals are often connected. There is an actual, you can trace this. And one of the things that, because I'm so impressed with both of your gentlemen's research, is I'm going to ask you to help us to actually do the research of all of the individuals from the Frankfurt School. And for example, this includes people like Herbert Marcuse, who then goes on to write Eros and Civilization. And I actually attended one of his lectures, and I can assure you that he was advocating the use of drugs as well as free sex. So anyway, there is this kind of interesting thing that's going on here that I've never really seen fleshed out. I don't know anyone who's ever done this research. I read the conclusion to the authoritarian personality, and I just thought, wow, that could be part of the basis for MKUltra, because when you look at the Macy Conference and you look at the psychobernetic individuals like Norbert Wiener and von Neumann, you really see a lot of individuals that are connected back into the American Jewish Committee. And so, I don't know the moral structure. I mean, I would argue that just the idea of psychological techniques on a mass scale is completely evil, right? By any criteria, there has to be a democratic sunshine that is presented on.
Joe, were you going to read that clip?
Which clip?
From the AJC article, chapter 23.
Actually, I did.
Oh, okay.
that was the beginning of it. What I read was the conclusion of it. So in other words, if you look at the authoritarian personality with the anti-Semitic scale, with the fascist,
I just missed it in your dialogue.
Then what you end up with is the idea that they would develop the psychological techniques that could be used on a mass scale. And so my question is well, was this an influence of what then became Subproject 58? Was there somewhere this kind of influence? Because one thing
mean that became MK Ultra in general, not just Subproject 58.
Exactly right. And so when Hans brought out that amazing, and I was just astounded at the Esalen presentation of the promotion of psychosis. Because now this is almost absurd. Today this could not occur, but in it was 1968. It was shocking that they would be so overt. It was just so obviously an MK Ultra concept that was being promoted. And then I noticed that, and Hans pointed this out, that it was at the Longshoremen's Hall, which is where the TRIPS Festival occurred. The TRIPS Festival is documented by Thomas Wolfe in the electric Kool-Aid acid test as being the very foundation of the Haight-Ashbury LSD drug culture, right? So the idea that they used this hall and that they had Ginsberg and Watts, both of who are on the record of promoting LSD. I mean, Ginsberg was basically one of the real Johnny Appleseeds for the thing. It's clear that the psychosis that they're trying to promote has a lot to do with drugs. And so I just want to thank you guys for that show. It was, I thought, really, really informative, and hope everyone sees it. And I would hope that both of you, being such good researchers, would help generate some prose if you think that that particular connection I see has any particular relevance to the trajectory that leads up into MK Ultra. And I know that people, well,
you got to let Hans and I jump in here.
I'm going to be done here both fast. But I know that people say, well, it could be anti-Semitism, right? That promotes this idea. But look, MK Ultra is a secret project. It's very evil. The citizen needs to do some speculation. So I'm sorry to be long-winded, but there it is.
All right.
Well, I would say one thing to note is that there's usually a soft sell and a hard sell. So even if you look at the changing images of man and Triss social turbulence theory, it's akin to Leary talking about LSD as being this doorway to spiritual communion, and then this other side of it talking about it being leading into psychosis. But notice both of these directions, even though one is valence negatively, right? Social turbulence theory, you're talking about deconstructing society, creating the state of constant social turbulence. In the Aquarian conspiracy, which is pretty much derived completely from the changing images, it uses that in a positive light, in that when we did discuss it, I think the episode before this one, and there's some parts in there where he uses some quotes and that are actually, if you take those quotes out of context, he puts them in a very cushy, lovey-dovey, happy context. You take those quotes out of the context, they're directly talking about dismantling society, getting individuals and collective human, social networks to be able to accept. They must learn to accept this, the overturning of all values, et cetera, et cetera. They have to learn to accept this, but clearly stating that this must be overthrown and must be destroyed. So you come down to actually a revolutionary ethos, right? A goal of revolution. In a way, though, that I would describe it as a controlled burn, right? You want to burn some fire, but you don't want that burn to go out of control. So you're actually setting that fire to clear the ground for something else. So, and I think that's a big issue with a lot of the stuff that came out of, Freud, et cetera, in that, number one, basing this idea of the repression, this idea of the fascist personality one of the big underpinnings of that is sexual repression. So then you have this whole mechanism, this whole cultural series of definitions that, if you're uptight, you're this, you're that, because you're not having orgiastic sex, or you're not having sex with small animals or something, or you find that disturbing. And so this idea of liberation through sex, right, is something, sex and liberation through sex and drugs, etc., is certainly something that plays directly into social engineering processes. And so when we move into the FM radio thing, I think as a dispersal mechanism, it's quite interesting. And I usually try to avoid making sort of global connections of who's doing this until I have, straight up documentation, to make it. So I'm kind of avoiding the man behind the curtain in this instance. But I will say that if you look at the two-pronged strategy, you look at this strategy of, let's look at it multi-pronged. First of all, you have the destruction of urban environment. So you have a process, so you talked about a bit of the automobile. You have, you have population transference, right? You have population transference, which is going on right now. In Europe, for example, you're transferring populations, and you're destroying the cultures that were there. Part of this was done, and in fact, it ties in exactly what we're seeing. That's why I think this work is very important, because again, I think everything we're seeing today can be traced back to these initial deployments. But what happened in Detroit, maybe aware of this, during World War II, they brought in a bunch of Southern sharecroppers who were not uneducated, meaning that they had been working on the land, and suddenly they left their homes and their land to go work in these auto manufacturing places in Detroit. But what they did is they built their housing projects in the midst of ethnic neighborhoods, right? You had these old Polish neighborhoods, you had these old other type of neighborhoods, and they not using a lot of the open land, but deliberately place these buildings right inside of a community that's been there for 100 years or more, right? And so immediately you're going to have a culture clash. And the second tier of that is that you've taken people away from their social system. You're taking people out of the South, where they have a defined place, a physical place, you could say even a spiritual place, related to the land, related to a value system. Suddenly you throw them in this urban environment. There's every kind of temptation, every kind of vice. You throw them in a place where they're going to be in conflict with these other communities that have been there, and that shit that would happen if anyone else happened. And you have these riots, and then suddenly, because of those riots, they decided to do this all over the country, throughout the North, is do these population shifting. Now, this isn't racism. This is a fact of using particular groups to, in this case, re-engineer the geography and the sociology of the cities. Now, not only are you softening up the political body by doing that, so to speak, you're losing these pockets of people that had very strong identity, that were very strong, they had very strong political potency, right? They shut down the like some of the movies, they had to put in the movie code and stuff like that. So when you have this dislocation, and then you have this move to the suburbs again with the cars and stuff coming in, so you fracture that, and then you have the media filling in, right? So then you have the mass media, you have local media, you have television, and things like that. And at the time all these things are going on, some of these are deliberate social engineering processes, right? Just as much as Edward Bernays getting, women to smoke or something like that. But these are being done on a much more mass scale. And with the LSD, this experimentation of human guinea pigs, on one level, this can be traced down to the simple bread and circuses, right? I mean, it's one thing when you have a population, generally speaking, if they become extremely permissive or loose in sexual morality and stuff, that generally eventually will not bode well for the society, right? So it's at the same time, this whole revolution of sex, revolution of drugs, is really an individual seeking pleasure, right? So in fact, with the Aquarian conspiracy, they're talking about transforming society. people are becoming more and more eye-centered. They're more and more hedonic, right?
Yeah, well, it's the century of the self, right? Just like that BBC documentary with on Edward Bernays and all of them.
You know, to interject, but Hans and I was so taken with your analysis of Trist's work, because you point out that at the end of the three stages of the permanent social turbulence, the individual has been basically placed into a state of disassociation, where he is completely into himself and he's really not able to make any decisions. And certainly he's no longer a cultural element because that's all been taken away. And so I just think that this appears to have been the goal when you now describe, come back to this concept. I just see the plan, not the research, but the plan that Trist seems to have put into motion.
Yeah, well, this goes back, the late 40s, and so this is, these ideas have certainly been around for a while, but there's a couple things. I mean, I think communication technology, especially the development of the mass media, but also the shocks, right? You look at the large-scale shocks of the world wars. These are also large-scale shocks administered to the body, to the planetary body, like 9/11, like what just happened in Orlando, whatever. These are shocks. These are, I mean, maybe not to me, but they shock the social fabric, and then so people have these moments of their guard is let down. They're very vulnerable. They're confused. At the same time, they may be erecting sort of a front where they're all in control. So you have the same thing with rock music, Kennedy assassination. Boom, you have suddenly this whole movement of rock music. And just one other sidebar here is that the folk music scene is actually where the hallucinogens were first experimented with on a large scale, and that's an outgrowth of the beat generation. But it really must be stressed that the beat generation was very small scale. It was primarily literary, right? So they did, at the same time, you have that guy from Gilligan, right, showing up on TV doing, what show I'm talking about, where the actor who played Gilligan in Gilligan's Island, he played like the friendly neighborhood beatnik, so he was in a sitcom. So there's
Maynard G. Krebs.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so they're showing this stuff, in the media. They're showing it in a way that's presenting, when I talked about, at least my interpretation of this idea where the individual becomes society, is that they sort of internalize their relational matrix, so to speak, that's in their mind, which is externalized through the media, right? So look at Life magazine. How many, if this was such an underground movement, why was this being promoted in Life magazine? Why was this being promoted on TV? That song, If You Go to San Francisco, timed perfectly to, like, the Pied Piper to call these people to go to San Francisco. So you have folk, in the folk music circles, people experimenting with drugs. You have even Wavy Gravy, hanging out in that era, in the folk era, also, involved with hallucinogens, and stuff like that. But again, you're very, very small scale, no real national impact. And so to take something that's, pretty much on the fringe, and I don't know whether or not, say, Kerouac was considered, I mean, he's a decent writer. I don't know if these guys were considered to be serious literary, figures or not, but, how much mainstream impact they had, a little bit hard to say. But even notice On the Road, the vector, we talked about this last week, I think the vector of freedom is the automobile. Well, now you have the vector of freedom becoming the sexual experience and the hallucinogenic experience, as well as this ethos that what feels good, you do it. You don't need to worry about tomorrow. You live in the moment. You just groove with it. Just get in the groove, man, and play your bongos in the dirt, to quote Frank Zappa, and then the world will change by itself.
Right.
As long as you don't forget the navel gazing part, you have to navel gaze for the change to happen.
Right. Well, you talk about that we want to have documentation basically before, we can make accusations. I agree with this. I think that the documentation may have to be analytic, because I think they probably have destroyed any sort of records that we might be able to reference. So we're going to have to try to use analysis to work backwards or even forwards, because I think the project's going on right now. But you know, I wanted to mention that if you look at the Grateful Dead, you have documentation that Harrison and Weir and Perry were active Freemasons, and that their families were Freemasons going way back. That was how Harrison described them, families going way back. So I think this is a, you know, one avenue of research that can be done, because you can see that Freemasonry is somehow involved in all this. It's involved both in the funding of the experiments of LSD as psychosis in the 1940s. This was documented by Colin Ross, and he gave Jan and I that information. You mentioned that in the Changing Images of Man, that Willis Harman mentioned that the symbolism of Freemasonry was sort of something that you know, could actually still be adapted to this new man that he saw coming out of all of this chaos. So Freemasonry has some kinds of relationships to it. Other secret societies can also be obviously identified as being involved. I think the Grateful Dead are a really good place to start some of this analysis, because basically the entire band reflects one secret society or another. And then you think about the relationship between the Grateful Dead and Ken Kesey. You know, they were basically joined at the hip to do these acid tests where LSD was first given out on a mass scale to the population. And Kesey describes this combine in Cuckoo's Nest. It's a combine. It runs the world. It has these spidery tentacles all over the world, and it's made up of many different organizations. So what is in back of the combine? I mean, this would be a place that, you know, this kind of research could be done. But all of the analysis that you're putting out, Hans, I think is both accurate and very, very significant and very troubling, frankly. It's illuminating, you know, this whole element of control that comes through the radio, but also all the other connections you show. So hopefully, you know, your work and our work can inspire more and more people to, you know, take up the cause of this of the research that we need to do to not just nail all this stuff down, but then of course to get the information to the public.
Yeah, well, one thing just to mention is that Stanley, his father was a government attorney in Kentucky, and his grandfather was the 38th governor of Kentucky.
Right.
And I don't have documentation in front of me, but you could pretty much assume that they were pretty high-level Masons. I mean, that was
high-level Masons.
And then, you know, interesting that, you know, he was in the Air Force, ended up wanting to become a ballet dancer. He started following the Bolshoi ballet, which is kind of hard to imagine that guy dancing, at least dancing ballet. And then when he was taking his, you know, his electronics courses, he got into LSD when he was devising electronics. So you see this media, you know, connection, not media, I'm sorry, you say these connections or these narratives, which, you know, there's probably a lot of missing pieces. And then there's an FBI.
Let me just give you one. Stanley, actually, the most interesting thing about him is that he checked himself in for almost 2 years to St. Elizabeth Hospital.
And of course, St. Elizabeth's is where Ezra Pound was locked up under Dr. Overall.
But moreover, it was literally the East Coast headquarters of MK Ultra exactly at the time when he was there. And in fact, MK Ultra is actually mentioned in the church committee. I mean, St. Elizabeth Hospital is mentioned in the church committee as a place where drug experiments were going on. And one researcher who didn't even connect to Stanley thought that this was really where the drug culture of the 60s emerged from. I don't have the citation in front of me, but I can provide it to you later on if you wish. But anyway, when you plug Stanley into that environment, then I think then you know, now you can just it just underlines the clarity of what you're saying, Hans.
Yeah, and also there's an FBI memo that purportedly shows that he gave LSD to Lee Harvey Oswald right before the. I can give you that FBI memo 896980.
Good heavens!
Track that down.
Well, you know, that's interesting because Lee Harvey is connected everywhere in MK Ultra. Let me just pull this up because Oswald, he shows up with ties to George de Mohrenschildt. Now, George de Mohrenschildt ran the Russian Student Fund with this guy that we've been continually exposing, this little guy here by the name of R. Gordon Wasson. Now, George de Mohrenschildt, of course, was Lee Harvey Oswald's CIA handler. So we have 1 step, 2 steps to Wasson. Now, I have repeatedly asked Lee Harvey Oswald's mistress, and that's Judy Very Baker, if she knew or had ever met Gordon Wasson while she and Lee Harvey were in the affair. And she has repeatedly dodged the question and refused to answer it.
Well,
I think that's an important, if you want to talk about the shadow state, I mean, that's a very important nexus of all that coming out. And, it's one thing to note that a media event or something like this didn't necessarily have to be liked by the population. The reason I just was thinking of the Grateful Dead, the logo, and then the Magical Mystery Tour, right? The Beatles LSD film, which was aired on the BBC, which was just hated by the audience, right? So Paul McCartney had to apologize for the Magical Mystery Tour and say, we're sorry we did such a terrible film. But the fact was that all these people are going to tune in. And so whatever psychological effects, even if they don't like it, that in fact, their aversion may even increase the potency of that. And I think that I'm just going to read another a quote here from Owsley, because I think I don't think we should neglect the idea. You talk about Freemasonry or Kabbalah or any other type of processes, that this idea of this occultic engineering, right? This idea of the transformation of man, the transformation of the population, and not allowing them to ascend to the higher states per se, but more to remove whatever barriers there are for the imposition of this completely amoral new world order. So, quote from Owsley, he says, quote, "Psychedelics are a gift of nature that brings tribalism to people. They bring an understanding of the ecology of the planet and the interaction of all living things, because that's one of the first things you become aware when you take psychedelics, how everything is alive and how everything depends on everything else. You go take a look at every indigenous culture that has respect for its environment, unlike the hierarchical approaches of the feudalistic structures that the world is run by. And you will find that these people use psychedelics of some sort, usually in a regular, ritualized manner." Now that's a statement that sounds like that could have come right out of the Changing Images of Man, does it not?
It does, and it could also come right out of Trist's work, where he talks about the disassociated individual. Yeah,
but this is Owsley, raving about how he loves LSD, because keep in mind also that many people were dosed accidentally. They were dosed, or not accidentally, they were dosed because he would spray people. He had squirt bottles and spray liquid LSD on people, whether or not they wanted to trip, right? There's many instances of artists or musicians who were dosed without them knowing it, and then after that, they went off the deep end, and this is, happened many times. But the thing is that he definitely talked about this occultic transformation through his sound systems, right? Through the alchemy of sound and music. And
let me read this quote from Marlene de Rios, who popularized ayahuasca, and she states, "Psychedelic substances like ayahuasca create a state of hypersuggestibility in which persons are very open to being influenced by others. Many traditional cultures have utilized this condition to inculcate cultural values and behaviors in young people as they receive initiation into adulthood. In the West, countercultural values can be inculcated in young people when using these psychedelics, especially when using them in an antinomian context." And of course, antinomian means of a relating to the view that Christians are released by grace from the obligation of observing moral law. And then she goes on in a study with Dr. Grobe whom I interviewed years ago. I interviewed both of these two. But DeRios and Grobe in 1992 discussed the role of hallucinogenic plants in adolescent rites of passage in threefold traditional non-Western societies of the world. In the West, individualism is an undisputed value. Since the end of World War II, the empty self has emerged among the U.S. middle classes with the breakdown of the family, community, and tradition. Alienation, fragmentation, and a sense of confusion and meaningless is pervasive in Western society, which particularly affects young people. There is a compulsion to fill up this emptiness reflected in various ailments of our society, in eating disorders, consumer buying sprees, and the perceived need for mind-altering substances.
It's interesting. Hans was talking about the deliberate shattering of ethnic regions or little ethnic communities inside the city by the use of integration, that they would put these projects, they called them, right next to ethnic neighborhoods, and thereby basically forcing integration, which of course would flood people into the suburbs. In the suburbs, the ethnic integrated community could not organize itself, obviously, in the disassociated cookie cutter houses, and so the people were fragmented. They were atomized. And then, of course, they were further atomized by the fact that then they would use automobiles to get to their work. So, that looks to me like very deliberate social engineering. And then go back one generation and look at the work of Edward Bernays, right? Who's bringing out damaged goods and basically beginning the process of sexualizing the culture. He also develops the NAACP with the idea of promoting integration. And so integration, of course, is one of the, it's just one of these almost taboo subjects to criticize, because the obvious, response is that you're racist. This is why you have this position. But as I have said over and over again, when you're looking at social engineering, they do it using elements that would be beneficial if they were occurring naturally. They're weaponizing them. This is when you see these projects going into these ethnic communities, it's a weapon. It's being done to shatter something, and this is something aside from the moral, question about integration in general. This goes to the intent of the people, the group that's doing the action, that's bringing about this specific integration, and so that's something. It's another area that I would love to see more research into, and I want to thank Hans for just bringing out these fascinating tidbits.
Well, I mean, a big thing to keep in mind is you have this population, right? You have this large population of youth from the post World War II, and like my father, for example, was involved with SDS in Berkeley, before, when the anti-war movement were people wearing, suits and ties and all this stuff. And it actually was starting to have a real impact. So this has obviously been discussed, quite a bit. But, what, you have is, I just saw this commercial done by the Ad Council, which was, they have this, which is pretty freaky, to be honest. It was pretty disturbing, and it has this looks like a mobile giant X-ray screen, and behind it you see these two skeletons kissing, and I guess you can't tell what gender they are. And then it walks out and there's two women, and then there's two people kissing, then it's two men, and then there's two kids, which is a little weird. And then, well, of course, the bone structure is different, but this idea, love has no gender, love has no this. Okay, so this is just a ramp up version of this type of integration. And I'll state unequivocally, I mean, I had a lot of good friends who were gay. I have no problem with any lifestyle choices, but why is this suddenly becoming an issue? Why is the CEO of Target willing to lose $2 billion by having integrated bathrooms? Why in a number of universities now they just say toilet? it's a male or female bathroom. Well, to be honest, I'm sure most women would prefer to use a women's restroom. You got guys peeing on the toilet seat. That's not real. But so that's an example of the same thing, except this is taking place on a psychological level. So these same, describing the integration, which that really wasn't integration. This was this thing that occurred in Detroit was I would describe it as a social psychological warfare deployment that was utilized to make the case for the necessity of integration because people were racist, so to speak. But you have these communities. I'm sure if an Italian guy
now people are sexist, so they're going to need integrated bathrooms and pedophiles and rapists coming into women's bathrooms and this sort of stuff,
Well, this goes back to the Carnival. This goes back to Renaissance, the Masons and the Renaissance occult stuff, the description of this festival. Bakhtin talks about this, and Rabelais, he was, I had talked about him, I think, at some point earlier in our series, but Rabelais wrote, he was one of those guys, he wrote some pretty disgusting and pretty disturbing things, but it's basically like, everything from sex to death to, the most kind of grotesqueries you could imagine was part of his writing. And he actually, when I did more research, it turned out he was connected with certain occult circles. And even though he had, he was getting some friction from the church for his writing, he was protected. But this exact same model of this inversion and the flipping around, removing any boundary or any definition. And I think this goes for something like Christianity because, now if you become more intellectual, you may not believe in Christianity or whatever, but think about it as a foundational principle in the back of your mind. So when you're just going about your day, you're growing up, you don't have to, unless, you have some whole bunch of guilt, whatever, but you have a foundational view of the world that makes sense. That you can operate in. You strip that away. You destroy that. And, yes, there are people that can transcend particular religious belief systems and things like that. There's even people that can possibly use sex and drugs for some type of consciousness expansion. But this is a very small component of a population, minuscule. When this is being deployed on a mass scale, you have this assault really from every single tier. And each one is like, if you look at it like a topology of all these different layers of, you look at society as some type of rock formation with different types of strata, and you start to destabilize other strata.
Let me just interject. I'm sorry, in your show you did with Jan, you talked about Bob Dylan and the folk scene and how that actually had been developed by the Communist Party. And that this was then when Dylan first appeared, as a folk singer, he was basically promoted by the Communist Party, and that he was able to stay at different locations. They were funding, evidently, or at least organizing his tours. And the idea was they had made a conscious decision to use folk music as kind of the one of the ways that they could basically change the culture, right? And so then this is a classic example of how you can weaponize something, right? So that this question about when you're looking at a social phenomena, is it something that's just occurring organically, right? Or has it been weaponized? When something as benign as seemingly like folk music can actually then be used, can consciously be used by people wanting to malevolently change society, then this is like the point I'm trying to make is that all of the research that we're doing leads to one conclusion. I'm sure something we can all agree on, and that is that the citizen has to be aware of the possibilities dealing with weaponized anthropology. You've just got to be on the lookout for it all the time.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true, and I'll just mention this real quickly. I wanted to talk about this last week, but if you follow this through of what's happened, I was in the course of my research, I found a number of kind of recent scientific papers, primarily on computer and data side. So I just wanted to read just a couple of these abstracts, which I think tie in very closely with the next stage, so to speak, of the fully dissociated culture. This is virtual gaming environments and we within. and abstract. Since their advent, computer games have been getting more and more sophisticated, especially in terms of graphic granularity due to fast advancing computer-related technologies, and are expected to develop into the level of perfectly simulating the real world in the not-so-distant future. This paper addresses the issues of virtual world environments both at the current level and at the level of the one presented in the movie Matrix, in relation with the future of the gaming environment and the future of our reality. In doing so, the current status of video games as virtual worlds and some views of what they will evolve into are given. We then discuss what shapes future virtual worlds ultimately will take and what implications they will have for future gaming environments. We also contemplate on what kind of impact these virtual futures will have on our real life. That's just one example of a paper. Right there, we have the simulation of reality.
We're getting nasty feedback from someone. Somebody's got their speakers too loud.
Okay, there.
Yeah, there's still feedback. Somebody needs Joe. Somebody speakers.
I don't think it's me. Could it be you, Jan?
Well, I'm wearing headphones. Somebody needs to mute the speakers. Are we there?
I have been unmuted by host.
I just muted this down and I was still doing it.
All right. I don't know what's going on, but we just got a chat message. It's Joe. It's Joe. Biggie says it's Joe. So, Joe, your speakers are too loud. All right. Go ahead, Hans. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, sure. Well, even that one, I think we could pull that apart for quite a while, but we have this idea of the virtual environment, right? The total stimulation of the external world and what ties into the total control. Here's another example of crowd control through needs and personality modeling of NPCs using AHP. Research into crowd control that enables human-like entities to mimic the behaviors of autonomy and basic human nature are underway to provide diversity in game elements. But this is basically talking about show the possibility of real crowd control by actively inducing method of NPC. I'm not sure what NPC stands for. NPCs to resolve exhibited human needs. So basically we're talking about modeling human behavior and interjecting either virtual or artificial elements into crowds to create crowd control. And so let me just read a couple more here. These are just things that I think tie in with the high security environment, public authorities, cloud, not so much that. Remote monitoring of electrical vehicle based on M2M in mobile platform. This is talking about modeling cars externally based on their batteries, right? So based on their batteries for electric vehicle, so they can be remotely modeled and mapped and tracked, right? So modeling cars remotely based on their battery configuration. And it has all this other details about that, how this works, but tying to the communication module of the car, et cetera, et cetera. So remote modeling doesn't necessarily say logical object, doesn't say remote control, but we're talking about modeling cars. And then last, mobile adaptive target tracking scheme based on prediction and wireless sensor networks. So this is using target tracking, using mobile networks to track targets, quote unquote, but also predictive movements, traffic flow, wild animals, even human beings in crowds, to do predictive target tracking and modeling using basically all the different wireless networks we have, right? And using that as a piggybacking framework, right? So when using the wireless network, so to speak, as a mesh or as like a substance, like a fluid substance, right? To model individuals, right? That makes sense. I mean, I could read a little bit more, but it's basically talking about using different nodes, detection and surveillance, We're talking about localization, crowd tracking, crowd prediction. Here's another one: macro data extraction and tagging based on political campaign scenario using HTML5 and CS55. So this is about targeting information for political campaigns. And there was a recent study that was done on how they could influence people's voting by just tweaking the search results, like in Google, right? You could tweak and valence the search results and subconsciously massively influence people's behavior in terms of getting a desired outcome result in an election, right? So the reason I mean, like I said, any one of these could be expanded ad infinitum, but I just brought that up to show that this whole, we talked about the network stuff and the whole FM radio stuff now being moved into a whole nother generational level of employment or deployment, so to speak, for it.
Right.
So you guys chime in there.
Well, you know, that and my work with Steve Outram that ties all of this into the internet and cyber world, and then into Burning Man. We can see how all of this is stemmed out of radio and the Princeton Radio Project, and they're attempting to create an alternate reality based on hysteria, essentially, and then spreading that out and pushing it repeatedly into this global computer network that they can then use to steer culture and, take it outside of the internet into things like Burning Man that then promote this agenda.
Yeah.
Joe is apparently muted. I don't know.
I think I've just been unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just
you had your speakers on too loud earlier, Joe, and it was in a nasty feedback loop.
Hopefully this is not causing now. But anyway, what I was saying is that when you look at the Gordon Wasson documents showing that they were with MK Ultra, they were trying to shape society in a malevolent, for malevolent purposes. And then you go forward into the science that we can now see that's being used to control society. The citizen has to be aware that the same malevolence is in play now, and it is a lot more sophisticated. I mean, when you listen to what Hans is saying, the last thing in the world anyone should do is just take this as academic information that's of interest, and we need more thinking about. I mean, this should be a call to action for every citizen, everywhere in Europe and in the United States and South America, everywhere. Because believe me, what you're looking at is the attempt to create a world dictatorship, which would mean slavery for everyone else, through these sophisticated techniques. So it's just really important that the understanding of the technology comes to the public, so that they know, how weaponized anthropology is being used against them, and also that there is a demand to find out who is in back of it, who is the secret society, how do they organize, what are their communications, what are their plans. The public needs to know these things.
Yeah, but another thing is that, like a lot of this research, right? These are actually mostly from Asia. These are just people doing scientific papers. They're trying to get a publication. They're getting funding. So what does the funding go to, right? So
and you bring up a really important point, Hans, because when do people wake up to the fact that they are engineering their own demise? For a research paper, a research grant, funding, all of this stuff.
Really good point.
When do people wake up that, all of this stuff that is being used against us is created by us, we the people, essentially. So these people in these, university departments need to wake up that it's their academic work that is being used to push this agenda.
Well, yeah, that's true. Then you have this process of indoctrination. You have the process of believing that it's for the greater good. You have the process of
greater good.
You're going to lose your job. You'll lose your funding. You'll end up working at McDonald's if that's still around or something. Or else, the other thing is that look at all these slew of movies you used to have, look at, say, like John Wayne, you have this hero who's sort of a moral character, something like The Wolf of Wall Street, a bunch of other movies. They have these completely amoral, dishonest, basically evil people that are being celebrated as cultural icons, as the epitome of manhood, whatever. And it's, I think more and more this is being ingrained in people that, if you're too weak to, break some eggs, if you're too weak to stab people in the back, you're too weak to make it. You just got to learn how to do this. And then as you get and Milgram, who we talked about at the very beginning, of course, Milgram's famous experiment, right? With the, and he's also the one who came up with the 6 degrees of separation. See the same person talking about network dissemination and then that stuff. So I think that's
well, couple that with all of this primacy of consciousness stuff, Hans, that reality is just a figment of your imagination. And so therefore, anybody that you would hurt is a creation of your own mind. So therefore, you're not really hurting them. So you can just do what thou wilt.
Right. And, Jan, that's a really important point, because it shows that all of these things, even though they seem, disparate, are actually designed to create just the disassociated individual. When you hear an attack on reason, you mentioned Krishnamurti's, like there is no reason, it's all just ridiculous, and don't attempt to know anything. And he's promoted. And when you listen to the celebration of psychosis that Esalen put on with Ginsberg and Alan Watts, they're all really designed to take away the ability to think. And this, of course, is just the last gasp of the individual, which had been supported and linked into a society. That individual then gets atomized, gets broken down, and finally he can't even think, because he's celebrating psychosis, and he's just been trained that this is a bad idea. So it's a large uphill battle for individuals to resist against all of these techniques. But it starts with awareness of them, and you ask, like, when will, people start to, resist being used as parts of the apparatus? Well, one of the things that keeps them in place is all this top secret clearance stuff, where I know even at universities that I'm familiar with, a lot of the funding, which you would not understand why it would be government related, these are anthropologic themes that they're looking at. It comes through DOD or DOD related things, and you have to have this clearance, which binds you to secrecy, and then there's penalties if you break your oath. So you can see that the society that runs us has thought about these things and has basically structure in place to keep them from being identified.
Yeah, and then you have this constant this transformation of society from love to fear, right? You have the 60s love generation, then suddenly you have the tremendous fear, then you have the bad LSD coming around, then you have the corporate shutdown, corporate takeover of, cookie cutter music, and then you have, disco, cocaine, which is a very different drug experience, right, than the LSD. Right. But then you have the self-help movement growing out of that. And the self-help movement is based on this sort of the primacy of consciousness. Look at The Secret. And so you have two distinct philosophical systems. So the elites are using an empirically based, say probably a Hobbesian model, right? Based on this stuff. And then they're feeding this model that everything's in my mind, man. If I really think hard, I'm going to get a new car tomorrow. And maybe I will, but that's, you see that, but you also see a stages of being broken down more and more. So I think, unfortunately, the level of deployment that's happening, A, I think the techniques haven't changed that much, but B, I think that you do have a pretty cowed and docile population, or else you have people that may be able to stand up. They're all being shunted into the military and coming back as, brain dead or emotionally wrecked, human beings. So there's, or else, so there's, it's definitely a dynamic process. But hopefully, hopefully even what we're doing now, I think, is starting to break that stranglehold.
Well,
I've noticed.
We sure hope so. And we only have a minute left, Joe.
MKUltra is being publicly vetted now as something that is ongoing and evil. I'm seeing it more and more as a concept. So hopefully the research we're doing is going to have some powerful effect in the future. Want to thank everyone for tuning in. Any last statements, John?
Thank you, everybody at Langley. We appreciate you folks tuning in tonight, and we hate y'all. And this is Jan Irvin, GnosticMedia.com, Dr. Hans Utter, HansUtter.com, Joe Atwill, PostFlaviana.org. You have any last second words there, Hans?
No, it's great to talk with you guys. I had a wonderful time, and
it's great. Well, hopefully you can come back next week, because we haven't quite finished this particular conversation. It's ongoing.
Yeah. All right.
All right. You want to come back next week, Hans?
I'm actually out of town. I can do the week after that, though.
All right. See you then. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning into CCN. This unique network is dedicated to free and independent media. CCN was created with the belief that information is the common heritage of all beings, which is why our live stream high-definition broadcast is easily accessible and free to view. If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Having produced over 1,000 shows in 2015, which are all archived on YouTube, we look forward to bringing you more groundbreaking, cutting-edge information in 2016. For more information on what is on, please check out our broadcast guide for weekly updates. CCN broadcasts in multiple languages and features some key voices of our challenging times who are all in pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world. CCN belongs to you, the people, and it is up to you all to keep this network on the air. Please contribute to the Network Support Fund or visit the CCN shop. We thank you all for supporting free and independent media.